Welcome, everyone. It is a great pleasure to join you in welcoming to MIT one of what I would call one of America's most articulate and influential advocates for the environment. I'm particularly pleased to welcome her because she's a personal friend of mine from my former days at Yale, Frances Beinecke. It's great to have you with us on campus. Let me just give you a little bit of her history and tell you what she's working on, although many of you probably know, but I have such admiration for what she's been doing. I want to share it with you. So in 1973, she was just graduating from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and she immediately joined the National Resources Defense Council. And that was only 3 years after NRDC was founded. In 1998, she took over as executive director and helped to drive a dramatic growth in both membership and influence. And today, as the NRDC president, she leads a staff of 300 lawyers, scientists, and advocates, and marshals the influence of 1.2 million members. In effect, NRDC has become the nation's untiring environmental conscience, and arguably the largest, most powerful environmental organization in the entire world. Most recently, Frances has launched a very ambitious strategic campaign, and I'm going to describe this as directing, I'm going to read from the Council's material. It's directing the Council's efforts on curbing global warming, moving America beyond oil, reviving the world's oceans, saving endangered wild places, stemming the tide of toxic chemicals, and, as if that were not enough, accelerating the greening of China. It's an ambitious agenda. NRDC came to life during a period of really terrible environmental degradation, with the idea of advancing the strategy of protecting the earth through the lever of the law. The organization has a remarkable legacy of environmental victories through the courts, from establishing emissions laws to curb acid rain to banning the CFCs that were destroying the ozone layers. The things we look about in retrospect and kind of wonder how they happened, they didn't happen just by accident. They happened because the NRDC was there. But under Frances's leadership, the NRDC has magnified its influence still further with a different strategy, and one that is near and dear to my heart. And this is through building coalitions, through collaborations. Coalitions of environmental groups, coalitions that unite government, the nonprofits, and industries, and, as demonstrated by her presence here today, coalitions with experts in many other fields who share her concern for our planet and its future. Coalitions that are based on the humble recognition that we face environmental problems that have a scale that no one organization, no one group of people can address on its own. For the past 2 years, we have been honored by having Frances Beinecke on our external advisory board for the MIT Energy Initiative, and we're hugely grateful for that service and having her wisdom in the mix. Today, she's going to bring us her answer to a question that could hardly be more timely. Can we meet the planet's deadline? Battling climate change on the road to Copenhagen. After the talk, she's agreed to take questions, and Ernie Moniz is going to moderate that conversation. But for now, I would ask you please to join me in giving Frances Beinecke a very, very warm welcome to MIT.
Thank you, Susan. Well, thank you, Susan, very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. I don't think I need my glasses. We'll see. I love coming to MIT. It is a place where there's so much energy going into the energy arena, and boy, do we ever need it. So it's actually restorative and very rejuvenating, actually, to be here, because you can retain some of your optimism that this is a problem that we can truly solve, because we are at a pivotal moment in the era of climate change. The Earth is changing at a very rapid pace. I think you're probably all very aware of that. So we're in a countdown to Copenhagen from a political sense, and we're in a countdown to Copenhagen from a scientific sense. And this is the thing that propels NRDC every day in the work that we do. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what we see coming and on the horizon, because We're really trying to put in place the policies that will allow the technologies that you're all working on to be unleashed and brought into the marketplace and really result in a transformative change in the energy sector that will help us to avoid many of the worst consequences of climate change that we see out there. And I think that you're all aware that in December, the environmental community, or the world community, excuse me, is going to be meeting in Copenhagen with the hope that an international agreement can be reached for how the world addresses the issue of climate change. And the world is really looking for U.S. leadership. That's a key element, a key expectation. And, you know, I have to report to you right now, here we are in October, that the U.S. is not leading. In fact, the U.S. continues to lag on this issue. So this is something that we're trying to change in Congress, and we need to change it as quickly as possible because people across the world are feeling the impacts of climate change already, whether they're in the cities of the Southwest or in California, where we're in a multi-year drought, or to Asia, where there are impacts from typhoons, floods, and many, many thousands, if not millions of people experience the brunt of these changes. So the question today is, will we act fast enough? Will we meet the deadlines that are out there? Ever the optimist, I think we will. And I believe that an absolutely fundamental part of that is unleashing technology. And in fact, the way I look at it, there are three things. There's technology. That's what you're all involved in. You have to really get to work very hard, make it happen. There's policy. That's where NRDC comes in. We work very hard on policy at the local, state, and federal level. And then there's politics. And I'll talk about all three a little bit, but I can tell you right now we're in the political phase, and it's the toughest, I can assure you. It's very, very tough. So, you know, when you come here, and I have had the opportunity this afternoon to talk to a number of students in the efficiency area and to hear about some of the research going on. And, you know, I really could feel the enthusiasm that's out there for technology. And it's not just here. I mean, NRDC, Environmental Organization, we are getting whole hosts of companies and individuals and venture capitalists coming in, talking about what they see, what their own invention is, how they can solve this problem. And you see it in the venture capital world. You know, you see it in new companies from New Jersey to Washington, all across the country. People want to design, they want to invest in, and they want to build the next generation of clean tech. And this is something that America has done through the ages. It's been on the forefront of technology and ingenuity. But, you know, there's no guarantee that we are actually going to proceed as quickly as we need to. And make no mistake about it, there's a global race going on. I mean, this is something that's happening all over the world. Every other country is doing it too. I just got back from China, where there is tremendous investment in the clean tech sector. And they have a national renewable standard, a national energy efficiency standard. China will build more of everything, more coal, more nuclear, more renewables. They'll invest in more efficiency than any other single country in the world. And, you know, we want to be sure that we're part of that investment, that that includes activities that begin here, that we can transport our technology to. So I think there's a race going on around the world. That's for the good of the planet. You know, let everyone win, because we need all that technology. I was at a clean tech conference in Shanghai. Incredibly exciting. It was run by the American Chamber of Commerce. There were probably 2/3 American companies or Western companies, 1/3 Chinese. The Chinese left before the end, and somebody said, well, you know, the Chinese, they're out there doing this. We're all here talking about it, but they're actually doing it. So I think that's a good example. We need to get moving on swift action and as quickly as possible. And the best way to do that is through smart policies. We need to both pull the market and push the companies through regulation. So it's both the carrot and the stick. It's incentives and codes and standards that have to be met. I think that's really critical. The president has acted. He's made a commitment in his campaign, and since he got elected, that this is very high on his list. He's made great appointments to be sure that happens. But right now, we're in Congress, and that's a huge challenge, and we need his support there, and we need to make we really need to get the support across the public to make this happen. Last spring, I'm sure many of you have heard Secretary Chu, Secretary of Energy. I was in a meeting with him when he had just come off of the Hill from one of the science committees, and he was talking about the opportunity of technology, as he does, but he came back a little bit dismayed because he ended up in an argument with two committee members about, is global warming science real? And I think, you know, that it was very dismaying to him, and it really showed us what the challenge is out there, that there still are climate change naysayers. You still have to overcome that, as well as move forward and put solutions in place. Fortunately, we're hearing less of that, and in fact, the House has passed a bill, as I'm sure many of you know, and there's now a bill under consideration in the Senate. But the opposition is still there, and moving a bill through Congress is extremely challenging, and I think that's where you all come in, because you're going to be involved in these issues going forward, and you need to be both the inventors of the technology but the voice for change too, because I think engaging in the political debate is very important. And there are huge opportunities here. We're not only in a climate change challenge, we're in a tremendous economic challenge. And I think one of the things that's most persuasive is that new technology can create jobs. It really can be an important powerhouse in creating a clean energy era that can solve the problem of global warming. So I have some slides here, which I'm going to go through. And I think that the science of global warming is well understood, but I'm going to pause on it for a moment. I did go to the Arctic last summer, and as this slide indicates, Arctic sea ice is melting really rapidly. On the voyage that I was on with many leaders, from the governor of Colorado to President Jimmy Carter to Larry Page from Google and MIT's own Professor Jacoby, who was my kayaking partner. I was going to bring a slide of him kayaking, but I didn't. But we saw the changes right in front of our eyes. The scientists, the climatologists who were there, who'd been studying the CPAC, actually could show us how it had receded over the period of their research, which was, I think, one of the things that's most sobering for me as an environmental activist working on these issues for many, many years, even decades, is I've never worked on an issue where the scientific community is more alarmed than the environmental community. And I think that is the reality of climate science right now. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few recent studies that have come on, which you may be aware of. But the reason I raise it is not because you're not aware of it, but because it's very important to keep the science in the front of mind. When you're working on these issues every day, often it's easy to forget about, not to forget about, but to put in the back of your mind why you're actually doing this. So to keep the science in the front of your mind is important. Recently, there was a study from the International Scientific Congress on Climate Change, organized by the University of Copenhagen, that concluded that sea levels are going to rise twice as fast as predicted only 2 years ago by the UN IPCC. Now, that is really alarming, twice as fast. And what's changed? Well, they just have access to more recent data than the IPCC had. And I think what that shows you is how quickly information is coming forth, and how fast the changes are in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, the amount of carbon that's in the oceans, how much can they absorb. These things are dramatic changes that will happen in the lifetime of probably MIT students, if not the faculty. So this is something to be very concerned about. MIT's own study on the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Climate Change shifted their calculations on how quickly the temperatures would change, and came out with a much more dramatic number, as much as 9 degrees by the end of the century, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which was really shocking and sobering. And NASA's James Hansen, which I'm sure you're all aware of, he's now arguing you have to bring global warming emissions down to 350 parts per million. All of the policy formulations have been to 450, and we're now at 385. So, I mean, our objective is to get to 450, but he's arguing that that's not even adequate because of the way the science is showing right now. And what about the oceans? And I'm going to actually show you a brief trailer on a film that we just did, and I have copies of this for everybody who's here, right on that table. Ocean acidification is a new alarming issue that is coming to the forefront, where the ocean's acidity is rising so quickly that seashells will not be able to form calcium carbonate. The substance of those shells can't form, and this is changing so rapidly that they predict by 2050 the oceans will be dramatically changed. So I encourage you to see this. And where is Jameson? There he is. He's going to make this happen for me by nodding his head, which is very good. If you can only do that with technology, that's something to try.
All life on Earth exists because of water. The ocean's power to create life is rivaled only by our power to destroy it. This August, Planet Green, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Sigourney Weaver dive deep to uncover a global disaster in the making.
We can go on as we have, or we can move beyond fossil fuels. We have to choose.
The ocean needs our help, and time is running out.
People have heard about global warming for years, but it's only over the past 5 years that experts really understood that the carbon dioxide is causing a problem for the oceans as well. And what's worrisome is it hasn't even been on our radar.
In just a few decades, it will profoundly alter the ocean's chemistry, rapidly making the water more acidic.
Scientists have demonstrated that if we continue to pollute as we are now, the ocean acidity will double by the end of the century.
And we're already seeing the signs.
We've seen water off the coast of Northern California acidic enough to start actually dissolving seashells.
If the smallest things in the ocean are affected by ocean acidification, then it ripples all the way up the food web, making the largest things in the ocean even more in danger.
We need to change.
We've got the last decade in which we can do something about this problem. But it's very, very clear that if we don't start to deal with it right now with very, very stern cuts to emissions, we are going to condemn oceans to an extremely uncertain future.
We know how to solve the local problems. We know how to solve the global problems. The question is, will we?
From NRDC, Planet Green, and directors Tristan Baer and Daniel Heinerfeld comes an incredible film that will make you change the way you think of our oceans forever. Don't miss the world premiere of Acid Test this summer during Blue August month, only on Planet Green.
Well, you missed it, but I have individual copies for you, so you haven't missed it. But, you know, I think with that trailer and what the film shows you is how dramatic the changes are that are being projected. And, you know, there's always the phrase, what's the canary in the coal mine? Is it ocean acidification? Is it the melting of the polar ice cap? Is it the fact that the glaciers in the Himalayas are melting, so 4 billion people who depend on the water coming out of those 7 rivers are going to be at risk? It's all of the above, and I think that it just shows you that action is very important. One of my former NRDC colleagues, and who's a green building guru, Rob Watson, likes to say, Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. Everything she does is just the sum of these 3 things. You can't negotiate with her, and you can't spin her, and you can't evade her rules. It's funny, I love to use that quote, and so does Tom Friedman. And if anyone read Tom Friedman today, you'll see that he used it once again, because it really does tell you the challenge that we face, and that we know enough that we do have to act. We're in a fix, but we've got to fix it. And that's where the combination of technology, policy, and politics comes in. Bill McKibben likes to say there's no silver bullet, just silver buckshot. I think that's one of our problems, is there isn't a single way to do this. There's so many ways. And, but you need a constituency and a force for each and every one of them, and that's very hard to achieve, whether it's providing more renewable energy, investing in more efficiency in our buildings, in our transportation systems, in our offices, or a whole host of things that we haven't thought about yet. Clean energy solutions are showing great results, and we have that evidence, but what we need to do is create an integrated national system that does that, and MIT and MIghty is definitely at the forefront of that, and I look forward to more information coming from you soon and over the long term. You know, many of us, when we went to college, when we started working, certainly when I started working, we used the telephone and the U.S. mail and bicycle messengers to communicate. That's what we did. Well, you know, things have changed a lot in the last 30 years. Now we have BlackBerries, we have cell phones, we have PCs, we have just every kind of communication system out there. But 30 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamt up any of this stuff, or at least I wouldn't have. Maybe at MIT they did. But I think it actually just, I mean, I'm optimistic about that because in 30 years, there are a whole host of things that we haven't thought about yet. So we have to put in the policies that get us moving down the road and actually allow that kind of change to take place. And where are the breakthroughs? Well, number one is in energy efficiency. And I've every time I come to the MIghty meetings, I argue for more investment in energy efficiency to really figure out how to unlock the potential in energy efficiency in the building sector, in all the machinery and equipment across the world. There are huge savings there, and they're mostly at net benefit financially. McKinsey's done a lot of studies on this, and I think it's very, very important to move efficiency as quickly as possible because it will actually be the thing that makes it possible to invest in other things that are more expensive. And so that's very important. So I'm going to just talk about a few things. These are really basic, and you know, they're not really exciting from a technological standpoint, but it shows you what the opportunity is. I have a colleague, Noah Horowitz, who runs our Center for Market Efficiency. He does a very simple thing. He looks at basically everything that's plugged in and tries to figure out how to make it more efficient. So 3 quick examples. Vending machines. Well, we have 1 vending machine for every 100 people across the entire country. These are refrigerators that are on 24/7, incredibly inefficient. They're not only refrigerators, they have lighting. And so Noah thought, well, how do we make these things more efficient? He went to Coke and Pepsi. They weren't really interested. Why do they care? They're not paying the electrical bills. It's actually the schools. I don't know if there are vending machines here, but it's schools, hospitals, public facilities that have these vending machines that are paying the bills. So he actually, in California, worked with a number of these groups to go back to Coke and Pepsi and say, we don't want to pay for high energy costs for these incredibly inefficient vending machines. And he got new standards for vending machines, which are now all being changed, which will save as much electricity as is in refrigerators in 10 million homes. That's a tremendous amount of efficiency on a not very noticeable item that's out there, the vending machines. He's done the same thing for flat screen TVs. He's now doing the same thing for video consoles like Xbox 360 or PlayStation, which I don't know if anybody has them, but in essence, that uses twice as much electricity in the home as a refrigerator does. And Sony and the manufacturers of these different consoles, they hadn't thought of it. It's not that they don't, I'm not going to say they don't care, but they hadn't thought of it. So you've not only got to go to the companies and get them to change their design, but then you have to create codes and standards for each of these. Now, we've been working in the appliance sector for a long time, but the largest single area of growth in electricity is in electronics. So, it's great that we've worked successfully in appliances, but we're now in electronics, and there are new electronics being invented and plugged into your homes each and every day. And in 1980, I think, it was an average, maybe you had 3 or 4 things that you plugged in. And now there are like 18 or 20 things that you're plugging in. So, it's not the sexiest thing, it's not the highest tech thing, but it's something that is a dramatic energy user, and it's something that we can change very, very quickly with some intent, and we're working on that. McKinsey did a study, and actually I mentioned that, but identified what the barriers are, and I think this is something to really think about energy efficiency. There's a lot of ways that we could think of to get more efficiency out of the system, but there are a lot of barriers to it, because if it was that easy and everybody made money off of it, why wouldn't they be doing it? Well, you have to figure out what are the barriers, and then how do you overcome them, and what are the policies that you need to be putting in place to do that. And we've done that, as I mentioned, with appliances, with refrigerators. We actually had a competition in 1980 to see who would create the most energy efficient refrigerator most quickly. That competition ended in a major redesign of the refrigerator. Refrigerators now use 75% less energy that they used in 1980, and yet they do more things and they're larger. So there are tremendous design results that you can get out of this. And of course, that all has an impact on how efficient buildings are, not just the design of the buildings, but all the things that are in the buildings. And this is interesting because there are opportunities in the existing building sector and in new buildings. So I was at a conference on India last week, and somebody talked about the 80-20 rule. Well, in India, 80% of in the next, I think it was 30 years, 80% of the buildings are going to be new. So to make buildings more energy efficient, it's going to be a complete focus on new building technology. In the United States, 80% is going to be on existing buildings. For us to really get the benefit of energy efficiency out of our buildings, we've got to focus on existing buildings. It's a very different way of looking at it, but there are tremendous opportunities across the way. Our another NRDC colleague, our one MacArthur Award winner, David Goldstein, who's spent a lifetime working on energy efficiency, says, the limits of efficiency have never been tested. We'll run out of political will long before we've run out of opportunity. And I wouldn't say we've run out of political will. The question is, do we have political will? So it's not only inefficiency. Another opportunity, which I know there's a tremendous amount of work being done here, is in batteries. How do we make batteries that really work? And there's so many inventive battery applications going on here, but we need to get them out of MIT and into the marketplace. I know there's MIT is home to A123, one of the leaders in the field, and I've heard Angela Belcher give her presentations on fascinating battery technology, but we need to advance that as quickly as possible. There are companies, I've been to one in San Diego, ISE, which is making new hybrid battery, I guess diesel hybrids with batteries for buses. But this is interesting. So they have this great bus technology, very hard to get into the marketplace. In the United States, because we don't have a big commitment to public transportation, we only buy 5,000 buses a year. In Europe, they buy 30,000 buses a year. So there's much more turnover there. You can get new technologies into the marketplace much more rapidly than you can here, and we can only change that by putting in the transportation bill and the climate bill policies that really unleash and demand that we move to these new bus technologies and don't stick with the ones that we've had for a very long time. Batteries are the single most expensive part of putting a hybrid together. GM, in their designs for the electric Volt, estimate that the battery costs are $20,000 higher than a normal car. Well, they're obviously going to bring that down, but these are some of the barriers that we have to address while we go forward. So how do we get the policies in place? Well, one big step forward this year was with the President's stimulus bill. I sort of say it's the test run for is energy efficiency and green energy tech going to work. He put $2.4 billion in for advanced batteries. There's a lot of other money for other aspects of moving to a clean energy economy. But this is where NRDC comes in again. One of the key things that has to happen is, one, the money has to get out the door. And two, we have to really monitor the results so that we could show that it actually works, that jobs are created, that energy savings have resulted, that what we've said happens with green jobs and clean energy actually does happen, because otherwise it'll be very hard to get the additional policy signals that we need. Our priority is to get federal climate legislation. We're working hard on that day to day. There's a very broad coalition across the country, from the business sector to the labor sector to the environmental sector, working on that. It's a cap and trade program. Some people like to call it a cap and invest program or a cap and dividend program. It's probably going to end up being all three, but the principal element of it is putting a price on carbon so that we actually move to investing in the things that are cleanest, greenest, and most efficient, and away from those that really contribute, are the majority contributors to global warming. In addition to batteries and efficiency, we obviously need a lot more renewable energy, and that's something which, there's a lot of enthusiasm for. But one of the things that's been a deterrent to advancing renewable energy is that the policy signal changes regularly. So last year there was tremendous enthusiasm, and then with the uncertainty of the renewable energy tax credit, there was basically a stop, and it's very hard. One of the things, very first time I heard Stephen Chu speak, he said, the most important thing we need is long-term consistent policies. And that's what we need to put in place to ensure that we can make these investments and really reap the potential of the renewable energy sector that we haven't yet. And that is, in fact, what I mentioned starting out, that's what China's doing. They have a renewable energy standard, and they are putting a lot of money from their stimulus package in renewable. They're making a huge bet on renewables, and we should be doing the same thing. Another issue that, an area where we need more attention is in the grid. We need more, we need smarter grids so that information goes back and forth between demand and generation, and we need smart grid technologies in the home so that we have smart meters and can actually figure out how much electricity we're using at any single time, and not only compete with ourselves, compete in the neighborhood, but really consciously use energy and not just flip a switch and think that that's the way it works day to day. And it's interesting, Dan Riker, I don't know whether he's been here, he's a former assistant secretary at DOE, he's now at Google. Google invented a smart grid application, I guess. He has it on his computer. And it's very funny to be with him because he can look it up. He knows exactly what light in his house is on no matter where he is. And he calls up Carol, his wife, and says, the light's on in the hall. Would you please turn it off? Well, she goes, what is this, Big Brother watching me? But, that's the kind of technology that's really going to make a difference over the long term because people will be conscious in the way they use energy. And that's the only way we're going to get the efficiencies we need out of the system. So it's not only in clean tech, it's what do we do about coal. I think everybody knows that coal is the major electricity producer in the country. Coal's abundant. We have a ton of it here. There's a ton of it in India. There's a ton of it in China. And they also have very strong political bloc in the United States Congress. So for a lot of reasons, we have to figure out what we do about coal because it's not going away in the short term, and it's really imperative to make it as clean as possible. So how do we unleash the potential of carbon capture and storage, which is something that really, if we're going to be using coal, we have to figure out how to capture the carbon and how to sequester it. I know there's a lot of work being done here on it. There's a lot of uncertainty about it, at least in the policy sector. And I think this is an area that really some help, there could be a lot of help from MIT and other places to really talk about what the technology shows you, how available is it, what will it take to bring it into the marketplace at a scalable level, and will it work? There are a number of demonstration projects across the world, not a lot, but to move it from an idea and a demonstration in a few isolated places to really the major source of, or the major technology in cleaning up coal, there are many, many steps in the process that have to occur. So that's going to be a very important thing that needs to happen. It is a fundamental design element of the legislation in Congress, and it's something that NRDC has actually worked very hard to put there because we think it's critical to actually getting legislation passed. And I know this is something that you will be working on, but I think it's very important in the longer term. So what role does government have to play here? As I mentioned with the renewable tax credit, government is erratic. When we were on this cruise last summer with Jimmy Carter, he was fascinating because he remembered every policy that he had put in place in the late 70s to advance clean energy and to advance solar, to look at what the technologies of the future were. He also remembered every date when those policies had gone by the wayside and where we had lost 30 years in advancing solar and other technologies. So don't underestimate the role that policy plays. It's a really critical element of it. So I think President Obama understands the role of policy. He's clearly made a commitment, once he finishes with health care, I hope, to address the issue of climate and global warming. The stimulus package, as I mentioned, is an important first step. It was a dress rehearsal, but now we do need a national law, and national climate legislation is under consideration. It would create targets and timetables, reducing, the House bill is 17%, the Senate bill is 20% reductions by 2020, going to an 83% reduction by 2050. The intent of the bill is to really unleash investment in new technologies, to get an investment in R&D and efficiency, and to really create transformation. And I think that one of the reasons it's so hard to get this bill passed is transformation is difficult, and everybody has a different view of what that transformation should consist of. So let me just give you a little bit of a political diagnosis. I think we're pretty far along in the process. We've gone through the House, we're in the Senate, where we've got the last 15 very, very tough votes to go. We know what the issues are of the 15 or 20 people that we're trying to round up. There are conversations going on right now. They're very real about how the bill has to be designed around the issues that are of concern, whether they're how we compete with China, loss of manufacturing, what's the role of nuclear energy, what happens to the rural co-ops in North Dakota, Montana. I mean, these are all very specific things that people are concerned about and want solutions to. Fundamentally, this bill is being presented, and you can look at the name of it, the Clean Energy Jobs and American Power Act, or the American Clean Energy and Security Act. This is about jobs and energy security. Those are the issues that the American public cares most about. The bills are framed to really address those issues head on, and it's the thing that is going to convince people to support it or not. So we're at a crucial stage, but we're going down the, I'd say, the final road here, and whether that's done by Copenhagen is questionable, but I would suggest that it'll be done by the end of the first quarter, and it's just the first step. I mean, this legislation will not be perfect. There's a lot of things we won't like in it. There's a lot of things that others won't like in it, but the point is to put a target and a timetable out there, put a cap on carbon, and begin to move the investment, how capital dollars flow into the energy sector, so that we begin to move towards a very different energy future. And I think that the jobs part of it is probably going to be the thing that either makes the bill pass or doesn't. We've done a lot of work on how many jobs would be created in the energy sector. We've worked with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst that's done job studies and found that over nearly 2 million jobs could be created in America just from the House climate bill. So one of the challenges is to show that that is really real and not just an estimate. So we're working very hard, actually, in states all across the country with our partners, environmental entrepreneurs, a few of who are here today, to identify where are these opportunities, where are the factories, where are the weatherization opportunities, where are the policies, how many jobs. And I think when you look at the job loss in America, which is really significant, a few jobs here, a few jobs there, they really begin to add up and matter. So we're trying to get as specific as we can, not just in the theory that this will create jobs, but in the actuality of where that happens. So, and just turning a little bit to the international negotiations, I have spent time recently, as I mentioned, in China and speaking with the climate minister in India. And I was speaking with Minister Shea, who's the chief climate negotiator, about 3 weeks ago in China about, is the U.S. moving? Well, it is very interesting talking to him because he has plenty of people here who are telling him exactly what's happening in Congress day to day, but he was interested in our perspective, and I, of course, was interested in his, because China, and I think this is one of the stumbling blocks in Congress, the United States isn't going to act if China and India don't act, but China is acting. As I mentioned, they have these national standards, they're making huge investments. They're committed for their own reasons, not just because this is affecting the rest of the planet, but they're very inefficient energy user. They're huge and they're very polluting technologies that cause serious human health hazards, and there are a lot of reasons besides the international climate negotiations for them to move very aggressively in new technologies and in efficiency, and they are. But they're not going to participate in an international climate agreement if the United States isn't out there taking very important steps. And there's a bit of a disconnect between what's actually happening in China and how several members of Congress perceive that. So bringing the story home, and we have an office in Beijing. We have 25 people. Actually, I met an MIT student earlier today who just worked in our office. I hadn't met him before. Who are working on energy efficiency programs. They are working on creating demand-side management, decoupling in Jiangsu province and others. And getting this story told back and forth is a very important element of what we're working on, so that we're trying to get at the misinformation campaign that's out there. There's so many. I mentioned Jiangsu province, where we have worked with them through the Economic Development Administration there to create something called energy efficient power plants, which are not power plants. They're investing in efficiency so you don't have to invest in a new power plant. It's really taken off to the point that the National Development and Reform Commission, the predominant energy agency, has proposed that they take that nationally as a policy. So, you know, what we're interested in now is who's more innovative, or where is the innovation coming from, and how do we unleash it and make it happen? And I think China is one place where we see a lot of opportunity and excitement, although their emissions remain higher than ours and will for a long time going into the future. Similar conversation last week with Minister Ramesh from India when he was in Washington. India has had a very firm position over the course of the year of not wanting to participate in an international climate agreement, very strong view. But they are taking actions themselves. They have an energy plan, they have a national action plan. He's started talking about figuring out or participating in international discussion in what he models per capita plus, that they're concerned their per capita emissions are so small. 400 million people in India live without power, that, you know, that they need to provide power throughout the country and will, but they are also investing in efficiency in their automobiles, in their buildings. As I mentioned, 80% of their buildings are going to be built in the next half century, and doing that as efficiently as possible will be a major contribution. I should pause for a moment to talk a little bit about who are the naysayers out there, because this is not a win-win situation. It's not like the whole nation is poised to move climate legislation forward. This is a very divisive issue. Principally the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, who represent many, many companies, have launched a very aggressive national campaign against climate legislation. They're taking out ads. They're in districts. They're going to town hall meetings. And we're trying to break that apart through other associations. We're in partnership in the U.S. Climate Action Partnership with a lot of companies who are stepping out, not only through U.S. CAP, talking about what the climate solutions would be, but separating themselves from the chamber. That's happened in the last 2 weeks. And that is very, very important, because it's important to have supporters that differentiate themselves from the associations. The associations are the lobbying groups. They have what we call AstroTurf, fake grassroots lobbying campaigns. I knew this had really gotten in front of the public when I saw a piece on Jon Stewart the other night, where he started profiling some of the fake campaigns. I thought, well, finally, this is getting out there. It's penetrating part of the public anyway, and it's very important to get that message out. So I think the final thing that I want to share with you is what role you can play. And I think that I mentioned several times the role of technology. That's really important. the role of politics is equally important. Being an active citizen, you know, sometimes I go and I talk to people and they think, oh, well, you know, you, the environmental community, or you, the Washington lobbyist, you're working on this, it's going to happen. I can tell you that trying to get climate legislation in this country that will really transform and shift the energy sector has got to be the hardest, biggest thing that we ever worked on. And it will not happen without a strong constituency really talking about why it matters, and why it matters not only in the long-term well-being of the human race, which it does, and the long-term ecological viability of the planet, which it does, but also to the well-being of people in the much shorter term. And being politically active, I think, is absolutely critical. And there are ways to do it. Now, we're trying to unleash working with others, a youth vote, and there's a group called Power Shift. I have a couple of slides here of where you can go to be active, but I think raising a political voice is an incredibly important part of this. And if anybody is from, even though you're living in Massachusetts now, from one of these states where some of these swing senators are, particularly in the Midwest, it would be a great time to talk to them about why you think this is something that can happen, because the clock is really ticking. We're on a deadline right now. Copenhagen is 60 days away. We may not get legislation by Copenhagen, but we need to get it after, because you have to frame it in how quickly the scientific change is going. Dr. Pachauri, head of IPCC, says if we don't act by 2012, it's too late. Well, even if we act now, putting in place the rules and regulations, beginning the implementation, is an incredibly laborious process. So, you know, the clock is ticking, and we can't stop it. So we have to move more aggressively ourselves than we have in the past. And I think that this is something that you can all participate in. As I like to say, I'd like to end with a quote from Gandhi, because I think if there was any change agent in the world, he really was one of the most significant. And he says, be the change you want to see in the world. And I think, you know, this is an issue of such global proportions, and one that impacts every single person, that every single person needs to participate in it, and I hope you will. Thank you. Ernie, you're coming up here.
Bill Mumau from Tufts is on the IPCC and told a group 2 weeks ago that the Germans had cobbled together what they call baseload renewable power plant. They took existing gas, existing wind, existing solar, existing pump storage, they measured it over a period of weeks, and then they subjected it to control. They actually made it a separately controlled element of the grid. Last week, Professor Perez-Arriga here at MIT referred to that kind of power plant. He called it a virtual power plant. And he didn't know about the German works.
Yeah.
More recently, the governor of Maine has made a commitment which is along the same lines. What I'd like to know is what progress NRDC sees in making this idea a central piece of the implementation, the science and the technology development of renewables and efficiency demand-side management for clean energy, please.
Well, we've been invested in demand-side management for 20 years, and really trying to change the rules of the utility sector, which requires basically Public Utility Commission, state by state. We've actually had great success. I think the place where there's the greatest success in that kind of vision is in California. Just last week, California PUC announced a $3 billion investment in energy efficiency. They're working hard on, they have a renewable energy standard that is bringing solar thermal into Los Angeles. They're trying to work out the transmission lines. So if there's any place in the country that that kind of vision is really happening, it's there. But you know, that's only one state. It's a big state, but that will only happen across the rest of the country if we have federal legislation that really sets a standard. And that's, you know, as I say, we've been working state by state for a long time. That's good because you get emission reductions with every bit of investment you make, but that cannot reach the emission targets that the United States has to reach without federal legislation. So we're working with it, particularly in California, but I think that Europe, in fact, there's a great article in the business section of the Times today on the EU's investment in alternative energy, very major investments going forward. We're just not making those. You know, if we don't get these investments, we're just not making them, and they're not going to happen on their own.
There's been some pretty serious criticism of the Waxman-Markey bill from some key environmental groups, not NRDC.
Greenpeace
and Friends of, yeah. I'm just wondering, how important do you think it is that environmental groups get on the same page to get some energy legislation through?
Well, the environmental community is broad and diverse, and we're on a spectrum. And we all play different roles. I think that the extent to which we can have the broadest commitment to advancing legislation, the more successful we'll be. Not that everybody has to agree on every element, but the issue of getting legislation, the urgency of getting legislation, we've done, I think we've been very successful in keeping a very broad coalition together. Greenpeace and FO also play an important role because they're out there telling you how high the bar has to be and how urgent it has to be. Somebody needs to be doing that, but you also have to work it through and face the reality of politics in the United States, which are very complex. One thing I didn't mention, but needs to be put in context at the same time, is that EPA is regulating. You know, so we'll pass legislation and maybe unleash this kind of innovation, but if we don't, we're still going to regulate carbon through the Clean Air Act under the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's sort of a choice for how it's going to happen and what's going to benefit the economy more, which avenue. We think it's the legislative avenue. Others think the regulatory avenue is better. Yep.
Yeah, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership that you mentioned is probably one of the most powerful and significant coalitions that's come together behind climate legislation in history. When you look at the set of companies involved and the NGOs, can you just talk a bit more about how that coalition's been able to work together and where it's been able to kind of speak out with one voice and where it's had a hard time speaking with one voice? Because you've got some folks like Caterpillar who have historically been a real skeptic of climate action, now starting to get a little bit more proactive.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been a learning experience. I mean, first of all, it was a real breakthrough. It's these 26 companies coming together, and it was a breakthrough because I can tell you we've never been in a coalition with the Forbes, you know, Fortune 500 companies before. But we came to it with the same understanding that the science demanded action. And in the U.S. CAP, it's sort of an interesting spectrum of companies because some, like GE and Jeff Immel will be here tomorrow night, really see opportunity. They just have, you know, they want to sell this technology all over the world and they want to get at it. Others, like Duke Energy, is the third largest coal utility in the country. You know, their message is, well, we'd rather be at the table than on the menu. We want to help shape this, not have it happen to us. And we agreed on a blueprint, and I think that's online. I don't know what's beeping, something. We're most successful in the big picture. When we get into some of the specific legislative discussions, it's a little bit more difficult. But you know, our aim is to have our differences internally and then do the maximum that we can publicly. I think it's been very, 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 very important. I mean, the Waxman-Markey bill is based fundamentally on the blueprint. Not that every U.S. CAP company loves it. They don't. There are things that they'd like to see in the Senate bill that give them more than they get in the House bill. But I think that those kind of coalitions, I mean, it just shows you this is an issue that covers all sectors, and all sectors have to be involved. And coming together with the companies actually gave us, I think, a much more powerful voice also in what the design of it would be. Because we're right in there with them. You know, we're not, usually the way it happens legislatively is you're sitting in the office of the senator and there's the company. And they run in and have their meeting and they're telling the senator what they want, and then they leave, and then we go in and do the same thing, and who knows what's happening. But if you can go in together, then the conversation is much more open, and you're really able to help shape it in a much more significant way. So it's been very important.
Geoengineering is one of the options that people talk about when it comes to climate change mitigation. That how can you engineer the earth basically to get rid of or to solve some of these problems. I was really surprised to see that it did not figure in your list of technical options, and I wonder if, as an NRDC chairman, you look at it in a different manner than we in the technical institution we look at it.
Nuclear, is that what you're saying?
Geoengineering.
What is that? Oh, geoengineering. We don't look, that's interesting. Geoengineering has not really factored into the way we think. I know there's a lot of work being done on it. We're sort of in the policy discussions of what you can do right now. So I'm not, it's just not something that we've looked at, because we're looking at what we can do right now, and for us that doesn't really factor in.
We'll have to confess, Francis, that there will be a geoengineering workshop here in late October.
Great. I mean, I'm not, just nothing, I don't know much about it.
I should, not from the point of view of desiring it, but...
No. We need all the ideas out there, I can tell you that.
So a lot of work is, of course, being done on new science and technologies. But one of the biggest ways that we could curb emissions that's feasible right now is in individual lifestyle changes, especially on the large scale. And I was wondering, how do you see that factoring in to the changes that will be made in the next few decades? Especially, I know that in our nation it's a tough question if we can enforce that with policy, but maybe in other nations as well.
That's an issue that is a really interesting one, because I think particularly when you go to other countries and they start talking to you about the U.S. per capita emissions compared to China or India or any place else, that fundamentally that argues that you have to change lifestyle. You can do a lot with policy. I guess, first of all, I think policy has to happen first, because I think we have to show that there are possible ways to address this issue. I'm heartened because I think more and more people, as they understand the consequences, actually are prepared to have lifestyle changes. But just for example, okay, what's the second largest source of emissions is the automobile. Well, we don't have a social structure that allows you an alternative to the automobile in a lot of this country. I mean, yes, in Boston, yes, in New York, yes, in Chicago, but no in most of the country. So unless we provide the alternatives to that, public transit, biking, walking, other avenues, then you can actually encourage people to take them. But if you don't have that option out there, you can't take it. So I think the two go hand in hand. I mean, just looking, what's our most successful endeavor of public participation? It's recycling. But that didn't happen because people were volunteers. That happened because, people kind of got onto it, participated once the standards were set, once the mechanisms were set for how you have it happen. So I think lifestyle changes are important, but I think you have to provide the choices and the alternatives, and then you have to really persuade people that there's an urgency to it. And just unfortunately, and this is the reality, climate change is not high on the American public's screen. Energy security is very high. The economic consequence, job loss is very high, but climate is way down there. So I don't think we're at the point where you can expect American consumer behavior to change. I'm hoping that it will get there, but not right now.
We have another question over.
Two last questions. One is, I think NRDC supports renewable performance standards, and the question is why that rather than a no carbon standard. Second question is, the title of your talk is The Road to Copenhagen. What are we going to find there?
Oh yeah, okay. So We support a renewable portfolio standard because that's, part of this is pragmatism, which is what are people going to be most enthusiastic about, what you can get support for. I think that's it, and that's the simple reason. In Copenhagen, as I said, we're dragging, we're not leading, and it will not be a breakthrough agreement. It will be a political agreement, I think, where people will continue to talk. Different countries will put some agreements on the table and some basic building blocks like forest protection, tech transfer, mitigation. But the breakthrough that we had hoped for, a big post-Kyoto international agreement, I just don't think we're ready for it. I don't see it happening. But I'm not pessimistic about Copenhagen because I think it's another step along the road, and I think it's a long road.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.